Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In this week's video we are going to be showing you how to sew your spiral. I'll sort of take you through. I start off by giving you just a little bit of the history and the background as to why I sort of stitch them in this way, and I sort of talk you through the sort of stitches that I'm using, but then you can use kind of any combination. So this combination uses stitches that have got gaps at 16, 14 and 12 stitches, and that gives you your three rows with a sort of difference, so you can see the colours underneath all of them. You can use odd numbers, use even numbers, use bigger gaps, smaller gaps. I find that 16 works quite well for me because it doesn't tend to overlap the row underneath until I get to the taper, when obviously that's slightly different again. Just before we start stitching our spiral, I just wanted to go a little bit more into some of the sort of the decision-making processes I made along the way, and sort of how I arrived at that sort of the design that we're going to be stitching. I've been quite interested in that sort of spiral shape and wondering whether or not we could stitch in that thread art style. I soon found very quickly that I wasn't 100% satisfied with just sort of going from one side of the spiral to another, although it can create quite interesting effects if you start to sort of play about with your stitches and play about with your angles. So I did sort of try and play about with it a little bit more, experimented with sort of colours and angles and shapes, and then I sort of found, well, actually what happens if I sort of stitch from several holes apart and to sort of create that sort of thread art effect. And that is what leads us here to where we are today. I wanted to keep that sort of thread art curve by sort of building up the curve with straight lines. I wasn't necessarily 100% keen on having all the sort of the layers overlap each other with the sort of tutorial that we're going on at the moment, but I was keen to sort of see how I could build up layers by using different amounts of gaps between my stitches. We are going to be using three colours to build up our spiral. I'm going to take you through how we do that in just a moment. And even though I use a template for a lot of my spirals, that I always find that there is always some difference, some sort of slight difference in the sort of the look and the sort of stitching appeal that they have. So there are a couple of ways in which we'll finish the tail off. I'm going to be sort of tapering in because my spiral sort of curves in to my circle. You can also, and I'm going to sort of talk you through this, we can also just bring the layers out and sort of stop them a stitch apart from each other as well, but I should talk you through that as we get nearer the end. So let's get into it. So I've got my design ready to go. I've got my needles, my threads, some thread scissors and some tape. My design is also pricked out onto quite sort of heavyweight cartridge paper, and I'm also using my trusty embroidery 7. Now with this particular design we're going to start with the sort of well, this one's going to be the orange layer, but we start with the inner layer and then we work out, and sort of the layers then sit on top of each other. Now I've threaded up quite a generous arm's length of thread in my needle. I've taped my thread onto the back, and I've actually come out in that extra hole we did just below the center line. Now when I started sort of stitching our sort of spirals, I'd often start in the middle, but what I didn't want to happen was for my stitches and my layers to start to overlap each other. So I started to sort of work out, almost sort of by trial and error and a bit of experimentation, sort of how many stitches I could count round to before my layer started to overlap. So say for example, if I came up here and I took my thread down here, I would be overlapping on that layer, and I didn't really want that effect. So I made sure that as I was working things out, that I had enough of even if it was very, very close, that I still wasn't covering that layer. So that's sort of the basis on which I've worked a lot of my sort of stitch patterns out. For the purposes of the pattern we're doing here, my first row is going to have a gap of 16 stitches, and then my second row will be 14 and my third row will be 12. So what I've done, I've counted the hole that I've come out of, and I've counted round to hole number 16, and I'm going to take the needle down through that particular hole. I'm then going to be coming up just to the right of that stitch and going down in the next hole over there. So you may find that you are having to just flip the page over a little bit so that you can get your needle in the right spot, and it will feel a little counterintuitive to start with, so don't worry about that, just keep going. And again, I'm making sure that as I place my thread in, so I'm now then going to follow the sort of thread art sort of principles, and I'm going to come up in that next stitch so that my short stitch is always on the back and my long stitch is on the front. So then again, I'm just going to work my way around, and you will start to see this curve start to build up. So again, I'm just going to repeat that and work my way and then keep going. So basically following that principle, we're going to work our way around and almost to the sort of the very end on that sort of outer layer. I'm reaching a point now where I have started to, I'm going to be starting to overlap my stitches. Now I've left this last stitch deliberately loose as a bit of a help so that I know where I'm going to put my needle down. So the first few stitches aren't going to have 2 stitches going round, but you'll notice now we're at a point where we're going to have 2 stitches going down each hole. So I'm going to pop that one and just pull it so that it sits nice and flat, and then I know that I'm going to be going down in the hole that was next to it. So I'm going to still continue with my stitch pattern, but you'll notice now that the stitches as we move this way will have 2 threads coming out of them. So I'm just going to keep sewing in that particular pattern and keep on my way. You might want to make yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee and get comfortable, and we're going to keep on sewing. So I'm ready to finish my first thread off and start my second thread, and I've actually done that with the same piece of tape. So I've got quite a little bit of a tail on that first thread, so I can just snip that off and pop that into the bin, and then I'm now ready to carry on sewing. So I can bring my thread out to the front. I think I've actually just covered up my hole, and then we will be able to carry on stitching as before. Now I'm approaching the point where I'm going to start tapering to my tail, and I've also noticed that I'm now starting to overlap with the holes, and I don't want that. So I'm actually just going to pull out a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to just use a clip, and I shall clip my thread out of the way, and I will start my next colour. And the second colour I'm going to use is purple. I was going to use the lime green, but as I was starting to lay it out, the colour was getting a little bit lost in the orange, so I'm going to just stop that competition and put a slightly darker colour in there so that we can see the layer, and I'll actually use my green on my final layer. So I'm going to start in exactly the same way and bring my needle through that very first hole in the middle that we went with our orange layer. The only difference now is that I don't want to come up in the middle of this sort of band of stitching here. So I've used a needle, another needle, and I've just sort of hooked it under the stitches and just pulled them away and down a little bit so that I can angle my needle out away from them, and they're not going to get caught up, and then I can carry on stitching. This time I'm going to be using 14 stitches rather than 16, and I've made my pencil marks a little bit darker so that they're easier for you to sort of see on camera as well, although if this was for more of an artistic piece I would make sure that I rub them out. So carry on in that sort of exact same pattern, but this time we're going for 14 holes rather than 16. So where my first row is very close to some of the holes, I'm just taking care that when I come up with my needle I'm not actually going to catch any of this sort of first row there. So I'm just taking a little bit of care to make sure that I am not catching that, otherwise I am continuing in that same stitching pattern that we've already established. Something else that you can do if it's a bit tricky to bring the needle from the back to the front is you can take the tail of your thread from the front to the back. So you can just sort of pull down those stitches, find that very first hole, and then in you go that way and just tape them onto the back. So I've gone through from the front, I'll pull my needle through. I want a little bit of a tail. I've actually got a bit more of a tail than I was planning on having, so I can just move that excess back through to the front nice and carefully, and then I can tape it down. Key thing if you're going through from the front is just to angle your needle so that you slide under those existing stitches. So I've got my second layer round almost as far as I can go. I don't want to sort of take it too far up into this because my orange layer, my first layer, is not finished. And now, keeping that same stitch pattern we've been using, I'm now going to stitch for, well, I'm now going to count 12 stitches and go down on every 12th stitch, and that will then give me my third layer. And I'm going to take that round as far as I can, but I won't go beyond my purple, or certainly where my purple is double, and then I'll be able to start bringing my first layer around to finish it off. So we're almost there. I've just got my final layer just at the edge of my purple. I've had to stop because I need to do my middle layer a little bit longer, and I'm going to just add in a few more purple stitches because I need to get my green, my top layer, out of the taper of my tail. So I'm just going to bring that round so that I can then just work the tail separately. So I'm going to have a couple of threads kind of clipped down, but it will make life easier in the long run. Of course, if it's easier, take the thread through to the back, snip it off, start it again, but because I'm only doing a little bit, I want to just make sure that I'm going to keep mine attached, just I think because it'll be a bit easier for me. We're now at the point where we're ready to start the taper for our orange layer, and what I would like to happen is to sort of take it as far round as I can. I'll bring the purple a little bit further, and then I'll bring the green right the way over the top, and that will complete the taper on that spiral. What I'm looking to do is to continue with the stitch pattern as far as I can. However, if you note where if I were to put this next stitch in, I'm actually starting to come over my holes, which is an effect that I personally don't really like. So what I'm going to be doing is actually using the holes in the previous row to help me get round the corner a little bit more. So I'm going to thread up my needle. I've brought it out. I'm sort of continuing my stitch pattern, but I'm actually going to be going and through one of the holes in the previous row and coming out in the hole in the previous row. So let's have a little look as to which one is best suited. Now I think it looks a little bit like, yeah, this one here. So I'm going to take my thread down through that set of holes, and there's no sort of right or wrong. It's a lot about sort of trying to sort of look at what you're stitching and look at what creates the best effect. So I've still got a short stitch on the back, but I'm coming up in the next hole away. So if I just show you what that looks like. Oh no, I haven't. Let me start that again. So we will go down in that sort of nearest hole that sort of prevents the overlap. So I'm going to go down, let's have a little look, in this one here, and then I'm actually just going to come up. I'll show you, I'll poke the needle through to show you. Now I want to make sure I don't come up in my stitches, so I'm actually coming up. So I went down here and I'm coming up the next one up from that point, and I'm going to take that down as though I'm continuing that particular stitch pattern, and then I'm going to come up again this way. So I'm continuing, but all I'm doing now is actually going down into the hole. So I'm heading towards this hole over here, but I want to get in so I can go sort of down and up, and I think I might just do by going down in this hole here and coming up in this hole here. So let me just make sure I've got my markers in the right point. So I'm going to go down there, and again I'm pulling the stitches away so I don't go through my orange layer, but this time I'm coming a stitch towards me, and again I'm just going to move. There we go. Lovely. And then we can move that one down. Now I want to get as far round as I can with my taper, and I'm just going to keep checking each time. Now because the tail itself wasn't, the width was set to sort of taper into the circle rather than expanding, which is why we're going to have to sort of make this adjustment. So I can put the next one along, and I can almost see if I get it lined up without moving it. that perhaps I want to go down in this hole here and come up in this hole here. There may be the odd occasion with this where you have to break the rule and you have to have a longer stitch on the back, and I think as you get towards the end of a pattern and you're sort of creating a sort of more of an artistic effect, then we've just got to accept that that might happen. But obviously we follow best practice wherever we can. So again, now go back down through that. I'm actually going to finish my thread off and start a new layer while we continue. So I've brought my thread up here and I'm coming over to this particular stitch down here and just using a little bit of a guide. I think it looks like, oh, it's a bit tricky, we're getting a little bit steep, but it might be that I'm coming down here and up into this hole here. So I should pop my needle in there, and we're basically just going to be laying the thread over and looking at where the best position is to place our stitches. I'm always making sure that I'm coming up with the row that I'm working on the outside, so that we can get round as far as we can. So again, each time I'm just going to be laying the thread on and going over. Now there's going to come a point where I'm just not going to be able to get very far round, and it might be that I have to sort of take, say, a couple of stitches on the back, and that's absolutely fine. You know, you've got to kind of adapt based on what you can sort of see. So it looks almost like I'm probably going down somewhere here and coming up on that next stitch up. So I shall do that one. And again, when I come out, I just want to make sure that my stitches are out of the way, and I'm going to take the orange as far as I can. There we go. So it's kind of keeping that pattern, but we know we're going to be sort of tapering off. So again, bringing that out, and we'll lay it down and we'll have another little look and see where we are best placed to stitch. It's almost, so I'm heading towards this hole here, but I'm almost looking at potentially going down. It looks like I'm going into this one here. Oh, keeps getting away from me. And then possibly coming up almost a few stitches away. So I'm going to have a slightly longer stitch on the back. So I'm actually going down up here, but I'm going to be coming out at this one here. Let me just make sure I've got that in the right position. Yep. Yep, so we go down for that one there. And then I'm actually coming up about that one there. There we go. So we're just looking, and again, there's no sort of, I can't tell you how many holes to leave or how many stitches to sort of miss out or to go over, but we're just trying to sort of work our way around. So I'm almost looking now at going down in that one there, and then we want to come out, ooh, perhaps almost up here at that top one there. Or maybe I might just change that one and I'll bring it out at the next one here. Right, so I'm a little bit happy with that. I just prefer the angle on that now. And it might be that we are going to be finishing our taper fairly soon. So we're going to just keep going, so I can pop that one down there. I'm heading for this hole over here, so yeah, we'll go down there, and I think if we come out at that hole there, so let's pop that one in. So again, a lot of it is just using the thread as your guide, making sure that you are sort of keeping that angle. And where are we coming out? We're coming there, down to there. So we're almost perhaps looking at, yeah, coming out at that one there. So we are going to have, as I mentioned, those few long stitches on the back. And basically once we've finished the orange side of the taper, we're then going to be doing the same thing with our purple layer, which is our second one to be finished off. But we'll get the orange round as far as we can. So now we're sort of heading off in that direction if I took it directly over to that stitch. So I want to almost sort of keep the shape and the angle of the stitches that I've got here. So I shall go down through this hole here, which keeps that angle, but I also want to sort of be careful about where I then come out. So I'm probably going to bring my needle out in this stitch here. Let me show you. Just to complete our taper. So let's have a little look. Oh, it's a bit too far. So I will at this point be breaking my thread art, the thread art rule of having that shorter stitch on the back, but there are going to be those points when we do need to have a longer stitch on the back. So that looks good. So we'll keep going, and again I'm going to be heading over here, but because I'm in the taper it's taking me right across, so I'm just going to tweak that angle there and use the row as we've been doing, and then we'll need to make sure we kind of know where we're coming out so that we get the angle at the other side here. So I'm going to come out in this one here. There we go. And then we'll bring that one in again, and it's quite a nice way of just sort of working that tail round. So we're using the thread as a guide. When that gets a bit tricky, we can then use the angle of the stitch, and that will also then help us bring everything round as well. And if I'm going to come out, I'm probably going to come out at the top of that one just there, and I'm heading towards that stitch there. Now my orange is going to start to taper off fairly soon, so what I'm going to do is just work the end of this taper just to sort of bring it in, then I'm going to come back and bring the second stitch up. So we're going to just come out, so I'm coming out next to where I've gone down, but what I don't want to have as I'm finishing off is loads and loads of threads just at this point here, because it kind of creates a bit of a log jam, and it's not kind of conducive to giving it a nice finish. So again, I'm just going to keep that angle. I'm still stitching into the stitches of the previous row, and then hopefully, yeah, we are coming out in that right spot. So I've just got a couple more orange ones to do, and we'll keep that particular pattern. Now with my sort of final one, I'm almost going to want to sort of taper that final stitch into that row, but because I'm just finishing the orange for the moment, I'm going to just shorten that, and I'm going down, just kind of keeping that kind of spiral shape. So I'm now going to come back and just bring the orange up and around a little bit more. I think probably the best thing for me to do is, rather than have a really long bit on the back, I'm going to trim some of that off, and then we'll come back and we'll use that sort of same technique just to finish off our orange layers. So I've reattached my orange, and I'm now looking at, I don't want to sort of come all the way over the stitches I've done, but I'm looking at how can I sort of keep that angle, where should I go down, and then I'm just going to use my thread as a guide and come up on the back, but I'll come up next to where I've gone down, and then I'll be able to create that next stitch. Now you might find that when you lay the thread on to come back the other way, like we're going to do in a moment, that you might have to sort of go forwards an extra couple of holes, but we're going to lay the thread on, get the best angle, and then sort of make that decision. So if I pop that down there, oh, I'm actually kind of coming down into that next hole, so that's okay. Let's just see where that leaves us. So we'll work the angle as far as we can, but there will come a point when we won't be able to do much more. So again, I've brought that out, and actually that's working really nicely, so we'll take that down again. And then we'll lay that on to see where that one is going to take us. And that's pretty much there. And then can we get one more out of this thread? We will be able to. There we go. So I think I'll just use a little bit more thread just to kind of come up maybe to the top of that curve a little bit more, and that then starts to give us a really nice taper. So I've got my new thread on, and I can just see that I'm keeping that angle and coming down into my sheet. And again, we'll get as far as we can, but I think we're going to start finding that the longer stitch might get a little bit flat, which is happening. Yeah, so we might be able to adjust our stitches again. So let's just have a little look, and I'll take that through. Go. Then I want to try and keep that angle, but I know that because I'm getting near the tail, that might be a little bit tricky, so I might find myself going through stitches I've already gone through just to keep the angle, but that's absolutely fine, because you're going to have your other layers coming over the top. So we'll just do that one. So we're almost there. Yeah. Once you kind of have got practiced and got a bit more confidence with this, you will find that you're going to be using it for the other two colours as well. So it's quite a good one to just have a bit of practice with. And then we're pretty much there, I think. So let's have a little bit of a review. I think I might want to make that my last one, maybe one more. Let's have a little look. Or maybe two more. So again, judging it by eye, seeing what feels right for you. Are you happy with the look? Are you happy with the effect? Yeah, I think that's going to be my last one now. So I feel I've got a nice transition. My purple layer is going to come over the top, and we've got a really nice base on which to work there now. So I'm now back with my purple layer, and I'm going to bring that round as far as I can, and when I reach the point where I'm starting to overlap the holes, I'm going to just repeat the technique we did with the orange to take it as far round as we can with the purple. So I've got my purple layer as far round as I can, and I'm at the point now where I'm going to have to start overlapping the previous row, which I don't want to do. So I've laid my thread down, and I can almost sort of see where it starts to overlap, and I want to come out so I can avoid that. So I'm actually going to go down in this stitch here, and then I'm going to come up further, one stitch further away, to complete the row. So we'll sort of do a split row for as long as we can, and then we'll turn off and just maintain the angle. So it's a little bit there, but the next one that's going to catch it in. So sometimes if you do find you've got a slight overlap, the one that I'm about to put in now will help pull the threads sort of over and out of the way. So I can see that I'm actually going to need to make sure I'm at the right stitch. That's going to help, otherwise I'll be too far down. So if I come down, so I'm almost looking to keep my angle up here, I'm looking to go down here and come up. So if I go down there, I want to then come up. Now you'll probably notice, because we're focusing on keeping the angle, that we will have a similar angle to that of the stitch underneath, but don't worry about that for the moment. We just want to get a really nice finish. And make sure, Elizabeth, that you're focused on the right one. So we'll go down here, and I think we're going to come up somewhere around here. So we'll take that one down, and again we're looking at what's going to sort of give us a really nice effect. So I'm going to move some of the stitches out of the way. I'm also using my finger on the back a little bit as well, so that I can move the stitches and not come up at the wrong place in the wrong row. There we go. We'll just that one. Yep, happy with that. So again, we're just going to work our way around just like we did with the orange row, that very first row. We've got a little bit further in because our purple stitches aren't as deep, which is quite nice. So that's the stitch I'm heading to, but that's not going to be a good idea because I'm overlapping quite a lot there. So I will take my stitch down somewhere around here, and then I'm going to shift to keeping the focus on the angle of the stitch. So I will come up in that next one away over here. So I will have a sneaky little orange purple one on the back, but then I'm going to now just sort of work around a few more stitches here before I bring the rest of that second stitch in the purple around. So I'm now at the point where I've started my final layer, I've brought it round, and I'm ready now to work on the taper. And I'm going to use the same principles of what I've done with the other layers. The final layer, because it isn't across 16 stitches, it's only across 12, I've been able to sort of extend it that little bit further, but now I'm getting to the point where my stitches are going to start to overlap. So I'm going to be guided by where my next stitch will land, but I'm then also going to be sort of stitching into that previous row again, just like we've done before, in order to finish off the taper and to sort of bring everything round and over. So again, I'm either going to be lining up with the stitch and using that as a guide, going through the holes and then checking the angle where I can to make sure that I complete the pattern in the sort of the way in which we've established throughout the rest of the project. And here we have the finished spiral. So again, I tapered all 3 layers in the same way, and I've just kind of taken in a couple of extra stitches with the green just to sort of smoothly taper it into that left hand side there. So well done. I've left a lot of my pencil marks because mine was sort of more of a sort of for teaching purposes, but when you've finished, have a final sort of look at everything, make sure that you're happy, that you've got rid of all your pencil marks, and if you need to, get rid of them really carefully. Now sometimes what you can find is that the stitches might sort of have a bit of a gap, or they might sort of have the odd thread that can sort of pop up a little bit and sort of sit out of balance with the rest of the thread. So what you can do is with the eye of the needle is just very sort of gently just run that round, and that just helps to sort of smooth it off, and to sort of just, if there's any sort of imbalance or anything like that, you can just run that round, and that sort of makes the sort of settles the edge down a little bit and helps your stitches to sit in a much better way. So just run the eye of the needle around. Obviously if you're running it on the second and third layers, take care that you don't sort of then crash into the sort of the first layer that you did, but just, you know, give it a moment, finish tarting it up, and then hang it somewhere with pride. I've got a lot of pencil marks because I say mine's been a teaching sample, but I might sort of trim this down. I might put a mount around it. I notice I've managed to get a mark on it from somewhere or another, but you know, that can be covered with a mount. So again, you know, sort of play about, mount it, put it in your scrapbook, wherever you keep your sewing. I also find it quite handy to date the piece as well. Even if I'm sort of using it for teaching, I can sort of date it, keep an eye on it, and it sort of helps me sort of remember when I did it and any problems that I might have encountered. So well done and happy stitching. Now, when we were finishing our taper for our tail, we talked about very much kind of falling into the taper that we'd drawn out as part of our spiral, and how we can adjust our stitches in order to then sort of create that effect and sort of taper into the end of our work. The other method I mentioned towards the start of the tutorial was where we would also taper to a given point, but we wouldn't sort of have perhaps the sort of full sort of seal of that circle, if you like. So the difference with this particular way of finishing is that my first layer, which is my very sort of pale lilac colour, let me zoom in to show you, I have taken, now at the point where I was going to start coming over the stitches on the row below is the point where I have stopped, and then I've just brought my remaining stitches down to that particular point. Now that means I do have on the back of the piece some longer stitches sort of trailing, so in order for me to then sew in that pattern, I've then brought my middle row down, and that has then finished one stitch further back, and again I've used the slightly longer stitches to bring that taper down to that particular spot, and again repeated that with the third row. And I've just happened to have stopped mine 1, 2, 3 sort of stitches apart from each other, but of course I could have taken it so that the outer row went the other way, so that my lilac could have finished there, my green row could have finished beyond that, and then my sort of dark purple row could have finished beyond that again. So again, you know, play about with the endings and sort of decide what you like the look of. You know, you don't have to sort of take it all the way into the taper. It could be that you take it sort of part of the way around. You know, experiment. On this other one, I think this was a slightly smaller spiral, but again, just sort of experimented with endings and sort of working out. And it can also be really helpful just to draw it out sometimes as well. It kind of helps you sort of work things out, helps you get an eye for placement, and then also when you start stitching you can decide which you like and which you don't. But that's just another way of finishing if you wanted to sort of bring the colours around in a slightly different form of taper.